Bacciu, and I work at the National Research Council of Italy, the Institute of Bioeconomy. And thank you for your interest in this first FirEUrisk training event online. But before starting our event, I will just spend a few words to introduce you the FirEUrisk project. FirEUrisk is a 4-year project, H2020, which started in 2021, aiming at improving wildfire risk assessment in Europe. And the consortium account of 38 partner research centers and authorities, company and first responders. Within this project, we will develop and evaluate a novel management strategy that will update the current approach to fighting fire. So we will assess fire danger and vulnerability of community and landscape, reduce wildfire risk by integrating societal factor and communication, and then also adapting to future climate for a resilient future. So our activity, the project overall, is risk-centered and will cover every relevant aspect of this issue. Also considering, as I already said, the context, the socioeconomic context and the socioeconomic circumstances. So, in this framework, under the work package number 6, the National Council of Italy, which is partner of the project, is organizing a series of training events in order to support the sharing and the inception of the project results. Between actors involved in wildfire management. And today we have this first training that will give an overview of the project new fuel classification system, and will be delivered by Elena Aragoneses and Professor Emilio Ciuvieco from the University of Alcalá in Spain. So the event, as you know from our email, will be based on frontal presentation and hands-on training exercise that will be completed on the attendees computer. So let me just introduce you our speakers today. So we have Professor Emilio Ciuvieco, who is a professor of geography at the University of Alcalá. He is a science leader of 31 research projects and other contracts with administration and private companies. He was co-editor-in-chief of the Remote Sensing of Environment, one of the journals with the highest impact factor in remote sensing. Is author and co-author of a very high number of books and scientific papers, as you know, and his main area of interest is on satellite remote sensing, focusing on fire risk and fire effect. So he also led several projects related to fire risk assessment, including this one, FirEUrisk, in cooperation with Professor Viegas of ADAI. Another area of interest is the estimation of fuel moisture content, human factor, fire occurrence, and vulnerability to wildfire. And then we have Elena Aragoneses. She earned her double degree on environmental science and geography and territorial planning at the Universidad Autónoma de Madrid, a master science in geographic information technology at the University of Alcalá, and currently she's a PhD PhD student in the University of Alcalá with Professor Emilio Ciuvieco. She's mainly working at the FirEUrisk project, focusing on the definition of FirEUrisk fuel classification system and generation of the fuel map at European scale. So her main research line are mapping and parameterization of forest fuel with remote sensing and geographic information system, and fire risk prevention, fuel classification, fuel mapping, and fuel parameterization with LiDAR. So I conclude here. I would like to recall you some, let's say, rules. You have turned off your mic and camera because we are quite a lot. But if you have questions, you can use both the chat or the question and answer button. And we will have, at the end of each section today, several question and answer session in order to answer to all your curiosity. Finally, I would also ask you to write again your name and your country in the chat, and also any project related to wildfire you are working on right now. So, said all that, we can start. So I leave the floor to Professor Emilio Ciuvieco.
Thank you, Valentina. Can you hear me and you see the presentation? Yeah.
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, welcome everyone. I see we have a very large number of people, so good to know that there is so much interest on this issue. I will introduce the topic, and then Elena will go into more technical aspects of what we are working on in the along fuel contents in FirEUrisk. Well, first, just to remind that fuel is part of the assessment of risk, and risk assessment in fire tends to, in the last years at least, tend to follow the same concepts that are currently used in other natural hazards. And then we can distinguish between two aspects of risk. One is the actual probability of that event to occur, that we call typically fire danger. And the other aspect would be the potential damages that this event can cause, which we call typically vulnerability. And that can be further divided into exposure, so those elements that will be affected by the event, plus the potential impact of that event. So in which way these values, let's say, would be affected by the natural hazard. Risk is a combination of these two aspects. So if we don't have danger, there is no risk. In a certain area, we don't have any significant danger of having an earthquake. Obviously, the risk of earthquake will be quite low. But in case also of having low vulnerability, also we will have low risk. In many natural hazards, like the case of volcano eruptions or earthquakes, we can only work on the vulnerability aspect because we cannot really change danger. In the case of fire, we can act in both aspects, danger and vulnerability. In any case, it's worth to remind that the risk is a human concept. There is only really risk when humans are potentially negatively affected by the event. Well, fires is an important issue. It affects the Earth system. It has impacts on atmospheric vegetation and social aspects. Worldwide, there is a very conservative estimation, about 4.5 million square kilometers are burned annually. In Europe, about 5,000 kilometers are burned. But since we have a very close interaction with fire in Europe, we have a pretty high impact of social aspects associated to fire damages. Fires have not only negative but also positive impacts. It's a natural process, a natural factor in many ecosystems that helps the natural regeneration as well as the control of insects and plagues. but also has negative aspects related to the atmospheric pollution, the socioeconomic damages affecting people's lives and houses, ecosystem services, plus ecological damages that are pretty much related to the intrinsic values of nature, soil degradation, biodiversity, runoff among them. Whether we have more positive or negative or very high negative effects very much depends on the characteristics of the fire, whether we have very intense or not so much intense or severe fires, the residence time, the vegetation conditions that cope, let's say, with these impacts of fire, that we call typically resistance or resilience, the capacity of regenerating after fire, and of course, the other non-biotic factors like slope aspects, soil characteristics that are very much associated to the regeneration after fire. Well, fuels is one of the key components of fire risk assessment. We need fuels, we need heat source and oxygen to have a fire. For the fuels are a very important component. Fuels basically can be linked to, on one hand, the more structural properties that very much are associated to climate conditions, plus the socioeconomic activity, and that implies whether we have more bio loads, so whether we have more vertical or horizontal continuity in fuels. And also we have another variable, which is moisture content, that is more associated to the weather conditions, so it changes much more quickly than the fuel, let's say, amount of fuel structural properties. Plus we have obviously wind, terrain that affect oxygen, plus the heat source. Most of the times is human related, but also in some areas, particularly in the mountain ranges, we also have a pretty important impact of lighting. So the fuel affects both ignition but also propagation. Very importantly, fuel parameters are very important for modeling fire behavior at different scales. So if we don't have a good fuel information, then obviously the models may not be very accurate, let's say, in predicting fire impacts. For that reason, fuel is included in most currently used fire risk assessment systems. For instance, the Canadian system, everybody knows, because we use actually quite frequently here in Europe, the Fire Weather Index, which is basically a weather-based index. But Fire Weather Index, we shouldn't forget that is part of the global Canadian Forest Fire Danger Rating System, in which the fuel are included. It's a specific module called the Fire Behavior Prediction System that includes a specific description of classes of fuel. Also, the European Forest Fire Information System, which recently published a report on the structure of what they plan to do, or some of these variables are already available in their webpage. Again, the fuel types is an important aspect of fire behavior, which is in turn a very important aspect of fire danger. For the FirEUrisk project, we have also defined an integration scheme that helps us to identify the main factors and components of risk that we need to consider. And fuel, of course, is a very important input of fire propagation modeling, but also fire ignition, fire emissions. So the different uses of fuel information that needs to be taken into account. Fuel is the description of fuel, and the characteristics of fuel are, as I said, a very important component of fire risk, leading to ignition potential, fire behavior, also vulnerability to fire, because depending on the fuel conditions, we may have more intense, more severe fires or not. but also we need fuel information to better estimate fire emissions, which also is an important component of their system. Quite significant amount of greenhouse gases and aerosols are derived from biomass burning. So this is something that we need obviously to measure. The post-fire recovery also is very much associated to the different strategies of vegetation regarding the resistance and the resilience after fire. In terms of risk reduction, we need to know how fuels are in a certain area to plan prescribed fires or land strategies or other measures of actually reducing fuels, because this is obviously one of the most important aspects of the current conditions, particularly in the southern part of Europe, in which there are a lot of previously agricultural areas that have been abandoned, and therefore fuels are more abundant, and therefore they have more vertical and horizontal continuity, and lead, whenever the fire occurs, they lead to much more difficult areas to suppress, difficult conditions to suppress. And of course, we have the adaptation to future scenarios. Most of the studies currently published deal with weather conditions, future weather conditions, particularly fire weather index or other indices. But also we should not forget that the state of fuels would lead to the scenarios of fire occurrence. And also we need to model how fuel condition would be in the future. And that implies to consider not just climate conditions, but also land use conditions and how humans are going to change the landscape structure. Well, in terms of fuel information, we should distinguish between these two concepts. On one hand, the fuel types, which would be the classification of vegetation, and that according to a certain fire behavior characteristics. Fuel types are mostly vegetation, of course, but also we could include their non-vegetation fuels, like, for instance, houses in the wild and urban interface. But obviously, fuel types most of the times are vegetation categories. But vegetation categories that are not classified according to the species or to other, let's say, biological characteristics, but rather on the optical and also the geometrical properties that affect the behavior of fire. The fuel classes need to be linked to fuel models, and fuel models would be, let's say, physical models that estimate fire behavior conditions, considering the main variables that affect that fire behavior, particularly the height, the loads, the particle size, the moisture conditions, etc. So we have actually two types of classifications, fuel types on one hand and fuel models on the other. Obviously, the two should be somehow connected because most of the times fuel types are used for fire behavior, and therefore these fuel parameters are required to use them operationally. There are several standard fuel type classification systems. This is a review that was published a few years ago already, but still we can identify mainly the fuel types from the American system, the National Fire Danger Rating system, and the National Forest Fire Laboratory system, the behavior models most commonly named. Also an important classification was proposed by another forest fire, by other U.S. Forest Service office. It's a fuel class classification system that is much more flexible than the standard NFFL fuel types. The Australians have their own system. The Canadians have their own system, the fuel behavior predictions fuel types, adapted obviously to the Canadian conditions. And in Europe, there was a precursor project that also modeled fuel types and proposed a simplified category based on Rodelm's model, but adapted to the European conditions that was called Prometheus. Okay, once we have a good fuel type classification system, then we can develop methods to obtain those classes. And the most common ones are fieldwork, that obviously is quite demanding. Ecological gradients, meaning the estimation of the potential productivity of vegetation considering different gradients like precipitation, altitude, temperature. So in this case, we do not measure directly the fuel parameters that we're interested on, for instance, biomass load, but we rather estimate that value from the the bioclimatic characteristics that would provide us, let's say, with a general estimation of how much biomass, for instance, would be in a certain area with a certain species. Remote sensing is doubtless a very important source of fuel information. We have continuous observation of data at different spatial scales, in some cases wall-to-wall analysis. We can classify remote sensing methods in two categories. On one hand, what we can call indirect classification, in which we estimate classes from existing data sets like land cover, biomes, vegetation that we close together to obtain similar categories to fuel types that then we can parameterize. And direct classification, which is the direct extraction or retrieval, let's say, of classes using remote sensing data, and we can do it at global or regional scale using medium to coarse resolution sensors. We can do it at a very local scale using, for instance, high resolution optical data, radar or LiDAR data. That, particularly the latest sensor LiDAR, is quite useful for fuel because it's the only one really providing accurate estimation of the vertical structure, which is very important, of course, in fuel types. This is an example of indirect classification using remote sensing, in this case, by crossing land cover and biomes maps, and then using the fuel class classification system to include parameters that could be used for fire behavior, in this case at global scale. This is something that we published a few years ago. Another one, in this case, is a direct classification using Landsat thematic mapper images, plus auxiliary information like digital elevation models. And combining these different information, we can try to derive fuel types. Some of them are fairly accurately discriminated, while in some other cases it's much more challenging, particularly those in which the elevation is the critical component, because Landsat data is a 2D sensor, only 2-dimensional, not 3-dimensional. But with 3-dimensional, we have the possibility of combining LiDAR data or interferometric radar with auxiliary information and derive much more detailed fuel type classification system engages using, in this case, using the Prometheus models. We derive a fairly accurate classification of fuel types in one study site in central Spain. Well, linking all this theory, let's say, to what we are going to discuss today about the FirEUrisk project, as Valentina presented before, aims to generate an integrated approach of fire risk, including assessment, reduction, and adaptation. And as part of that, we are working along with other colleagues in generating first a classification system that could be adapted to the European conditions, scale independent, and then develop methods to obtain the fuel classes, the data set that cover the whole Europe. For the FirEUrisk project, we have two target scales, one covering the full European territory at 1 square kilometer, and another one for a certain pilot sites, 5 pilot sites, at 1 hectare would be the target resolution. We are going mainly to present the European scale in this seminar, but there are other groups working also on the pilot site level with different techniques. So basically, we first developed this fuel class classification system that Elena will mention in more detail, and also generate the methodology to obtain the final data set that also will be presented by Elena. And therefore, we will provide some ideas on how the parameters will be derived. The situation that we found in Europe is that there was several papers published with different regional studies, local studies, sometimes with their own cost of fuel types adapted to those conditions, but not generalized to other situations in Europe, with the exception of one European data set that was developed within the European Forest Fire Information Systems in the 2000s, early 2000s, and the ARC Fuel project that generated also a fuel classification, particularly for the Southern Europe. So our challenge was to develop a fire fuel type classification system that would be adapted to European conditions, and hopefully also it would be useful for other countries, as well as a methodology that could be used for generating those classes on one hand, and also including parameters. Now, we have to keep in mind these two aspects, the fuel type classification on one hand and the fuel model. The link between the two would be necessary, particularly for fire behavior modeling. So this is what I planning to say at this point, and I leave to Elena to continue with the description of this class classification system.
Thank you, Emilio. I'm going to share my screen now. Okay. So thank you, Emilio, for this introduction. I believe it was very interesting to know about fuel types and fire behavior and modeling. And now we are entering into more detail, because first I'm going to talk about a bit theoretical part about the FirEUrisk fuel classification system that we develop and the FirEUrisk European fuel map. And then we will do a little practical part to derive parameters of this European fuel map. So first, the first part regarding the FirEUrisk fuel classification system, as we were saying before, we wanted to develop this classification system that should be useful for the actual limitations and conditions of fuel mapping. So when we first started thinking about how to build this classification system, we did literature review to see what has been done before and how other pre-existent fuel classification systems were delivered. And also we combined with expert knowledge, which means that we asked people working in fire risk and fire behavior modeling to ask them which were the things that they wanted to be improved in field classification systems, so that we try to somehow fulfill these limitations. And one of the main characteristics of the resulting FirEUrisk field classification system is that it has two hierarchical levels. So in the classification system, we can distinguish the first level, which is intended for the continental scale because it refers to more general fuel types, and a second level, which is intended for regional and local scales, which has more in detail fuel types. But the good thing about these two levels is that they are scalable, so that the general first level fuel types can be split into more in detail fuel types up to the second level. So this hierarchical scheme, what provides is that we can apply this fuel classification system for different spatial scales and be able to compare fuel maps, for example, at the continental scale and at a more regional or local scale. and even compare maps and integrate field maps from different areas, because in the past what we found is that each country or region had their own custom field classification system. So field maps were very difficult to compare. Now with this integrated FirEUrisk field classification system, what we aim is to be able to integrate and compare these field maps between different regions and spatial scales. When we were thinking about the requirements that we wanted for the field classification system, we were also thinking that they should be useful for different fire applications. So it should be useful for fire ignition, propagation, and emissions to try to account for the whole fire risk issue. Also, we wanted it to be suitable for a wide range of conditions, so not only for Europe, but it can be applied worldwide, because the field categories that are defined can be found in all around the world and it can be useful. Also, one important thing and very novel is that we accounted both for surface and ground field types, because normally pre-existing field classification systems only refer to surface field types. And in our case, we wanted to account for both the surface and the ground field types, to account for both the surface and the ground fires, because ground fires are the most severe and the ones that cause most damages. So in our perspective, it is very important to also consider them in the field mapping. And finally, what we wanted so far was to improve somehow the existing field classification systems and the field mapping in Europe. So continuing with this, as we were saying, one of the main characteristics is that the FirEUrisk field classification system is hierarchical. So we have different definition of field type categories depending on the level of detail we are working on. The main driver is fire behavior, although it is also expected to be useful for fire assessment and emissions. And we define the field type categories according to the United Nations Land Cover Classification System, the FAO, the Corine Land Cover categories, and for the case of the wet and pit, semi-pitland field types, we use the definition provided by the International Pitland Society, so that we had a common definition of categories. And the main properties, as we were saying, are the hierarchical scheme, its multi-purpose structure, that it allows to update fuel mapping regularly, that we account for both canopy and surface fuels. And one of the most interesting things that we did was also to include some field type categories that were not previously considered and that are also important for fire risk. In this case, we included first the urban fuels that refer to the intermix and the interface of the wild and urban interface, to try to account for fire risk affecting human settlements, health, and societal and economical values. And we also included field type categories referring to wet and pit, semi-pitland field types regarding emissions, because as we might know, when wet and pit, semi-pitland is burned, they release a lot of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. So this is key to understand fire emissions. And finally, our field classification system would allow field parameterization, as I'm going to explain in further slides, which can be used for fire behavior modeling. All of these, the FirEUrisk field classification system, and what we are going to be talking today, is currently under review in a paper called Classification and Mapping of European Fields using a hierarchical multipurpose field classification system in the Earth System Science Data. The paper has been done with the work of the University of Alcalá, Professor Emilio Chubieco, Mariano García, and myself, but also with other experts in the field, like Michele Salis from CNR in Italy and Luis Mario Ribeiro from University of Coimbra. The paper is currently under review, but we have received very nice critics so far, so we expect that it's accepted very soon. This paper, you can find it attached in the shared files that we shared with you some days ago. So continuing with the FirEUrisk field classification system, as I told you before, it has a hierarchical structure and is divided into 6 main field type categories, which are forest, shrubland, grassland, cropland, wet and peat, semi-peat land, urban, and a non-field category, which is referring to non-vulnerable area. Here you have a brief definition of these main categories, and because of the hierarchical scheme of the classification system, these 6 main categories can be split up to a total of 85 field types if we consider both the first and the second level. Now going in more detail on how these categories are split, in the case of forest, we can split according to canopy strata for the first level, the one which is intended for continental scales, according to leaf type, phenology, and canopy cover density. And we can also split categories according to understory strata for the second level, the one intended for local and regional scales, according to understory type and understory height. In the case of the main covers of shrubland and grassland, we can divide subcategories for the first level according to field bed depth, according to different thresholds that were decided by experts. In the case of cropland, we can divide between herbaceous and woody cropland. In the case of wet and peat, semi-peat land, we can distinguish between tree, shrublands, and grassland, wet and peat, semi-peat land. And in the case of urban fields, we can distinguish between continuous and discontinuous fabric for the first level. And also for non-field, we can distinguish for the second level between water, snow and ice, and bare soil and sparse vegetation. So here we have an overview of what the field classification system looks like for the first level, the one intended for continental global scales. We have the 6 main field types: forest, shrubland, grassland, cropland, wet and peat, semi-peatland, urban, and plus the non-field category. And we have up to 24 field types because we are only referring to the first level. If we continued up to the second level, we will have up to 85 field types. You can find more details on this scheme and read more about the definition of classes and have a complete table with the field classification system in the product user manual of the European field map, which I show you here the link. And I also shared with you in the files that we sent you some days ago, and also in the paper. So how would we read this scheme? So we have field type codes referring to each of our field type categories in a hierarchical structure. So for example, if we have a field type which is 1111, this means that we are referring to a forest field type, which is broadleaf, evergreen, and open. And this would be the way how we would read up to the hierarchical level that we reached our legend. So once we developed the FirEUrisk field classification system, we applied it to develop a European field map. The European field map can be freely accessed by direct download from the repository Consortium Madroño, which is where it is stored, and you have the link here. And it is in GOT format in one single band categorical raster layer and has a spatial resolution of 1 kilometer. The spatial projection is ETRS 89 Lambert-Ansi mutual equal area because it's the ideal to preserve area in Europe. And it was generated with a total of 20 out of the 24 first level field types from the FirEUrisk field classification system. Not all first level field types were found in the European field map because we are working at 1 kilometer resolution. This means that for a field type to appear in this map, it has to occupy an area large enough to be seen at 1 kilometer resolution. And this was not the case for 4 of the field types. But this doesn't mean that they don't exist in Europe. This just means that at 1 kilometer resolution, they are not that important. So the results of this European field map is that the field types that cover most extension in Europe are croplands with a 38%, mostly referring to herbaceous cropland, followed by forest, which occupy a 33% of the European territory, mostly referring to close needle-leaf evergreen forest. And the overall accuracy for all fields of this map is 80.92%, but later on I'm going to explain more in detail this validation of the map. So as I was saying before, this map can be directly accessed by downloading the raster layer from the Consortium Madroño repository. Here you have the link, it's very easy, you don't have to register or anything. And if you open the downloaded map in a GIS software, it would display something like this. Also, in the same repository, you can find the product user manual, which I encourage you to read if you have any doubts when using the product, to understand the methodology, the results, etc., because it is very useful and also a good summarizing of what has been and maybe where problems can come from. So now going into more technical details, how the European field map was developed. Well, the methods that we develop for developing the European field map can be easily applied to other areas because we extracted information from pre-existing input layers, mainly land cover datasets, biogeographic region datasets, and bioclimatic modeling. And then, after a first preliminary European field map, we applied further processing, which consisted on smoothing, on resampling to the 1 kilometer resolution through a custom resampling method, and to perform the validation. So, regarding the generation of the European field map, as I was saying before, we first used land cover datasets for generating this European field map. We used 4 land cover datasets: the CCI-LC map, the Copernicus Global Land Cover Map, the Corine Land Cover Map, and the built-up fraction cover Copernicus Global Land Cover Map. But from all these 4 land cover datasets, we used the Copernicus Global Land Cover Map as the base cartography because the land cover types defined in the Copernicus Global Land Cover Maps were very similar to our FirEUrisk field type categories that we defined. So what we did was to first try to extract the information from this layer, from the Copernicus Global Land Cover Map, and only when this data set by itself was not enough to derive the information that we wanted, then we relied on the auxiliary land cover datasets of the CCI-LC map, the Corine Land Cover Map, and the built-up fraction cover Copernicus GLC map. And also an important thing to say is that because we used the Copernicus Global Land Cover Map as base cartography, and this map had a resolution of 100 meters, we first resampled all the land cover datasets to 100 meter resolution, even if they had coarse resolution. We did this as a first step, and later on, then we resampled to the 1 kilometer resolution. One also important thing is that for the case of shrubland and grassland field types, we applied some bioclimatic modeling to derive field depth. As we saw, field depth is one of the splitting criteria used to split categories for shrubland and grassland field types. And what we did here was, for the case of shrubland, we started from a precipitation dataset, and we transformed this precipitation data into potential shrubland productivity, and this into potential shrubland field depth. We did this through several equations developed for this purpose. And in the case of grassland, we did a very similar approach. We started from a data set with the productivity of grassland according to an inventory, and we transform it to a grassland potential and field depth through some equations developed for this purpose. So once we have this this preliminary European field map by applying this procedure, we proceeded then to the further processing. First of all, we smooth our map by applying a majority filtering with a 5x5 moving window, and we resample it to the 1 kilometer resolution, because remember that I told you at the beginning that we first resampled all of our data sets into 100-meter resolution to match our base cartography. So we had now to resample to 1 kilometer resolution. This was necessary because, for example, for the shrubland bioclimatic modeling, we are using precipitation data, which has very coarse resolution. So the best performance is to resample everything to 1 kilometer resolution, which is the resolution of the original precipitation data. So for the resampling, what we did was to develop a custom method trying to account for a spatial heterogeneity of European landscapes. And we based this resampling method on the proportion of area occupied by each field type within a 1 kilometer pixel using this table. So for example, first row, if we had a 1 kilometer pixel that had a high proportion of broadleaf forest and a high proportion of also needle-leaf forest, our target field map with 1 kilometer resolution would have in that pixel a mixed forest, because it's the most logical thing if we are thinking about the spatial heterogeneity of European landscapes. The same would happen, for example, in the second row, if we have a pixel with a high proportion of evergreen forest and also a high proportion of deciduous forest that we would have in the target European field map mixed forest. But we also try to account for the most risky conditions. So, for example, if we had a pixel with a high proportion of shrubland and also a high proportion of grassland, in our target European field map we would have grassland as the field type, because grassland implies more risk. This way, we are preventing somehow the most risky conditions in the field when we find mixed pixels, which are very common in 1 kilometer resolution. So now that we more or less understand how the European field map was built, it is interesting to understand the limitations of the methods, because they would lead to the quality and errors of the European field map. So first, we have to understand that field types are have very high spatiotemporal variability. This is also something related to the time of the European field map, because the input layers used for the European field map are from 2018 till 2020. So if we are, for example, observing in the field the current conditions, it is important to consider that field types can have changed in these recent times, but also field types can vary within the year. This is, for example, the case of grassland and shrubland, for which estimating field depth is very challenging. First of all, because we are talking about very high precision, we are talking about centimeters, and second, because, for example, in the case of grassland height varies a lot within time, within the year, because it is frequently cut. So in this case, the European field map will only be accurate for certain periods of the year, depending on if the grassland is cut or not. Also, we have to consider that the European field map and the FirEUrisk field classification system required somehow to generalize the great variety of field types, because we need to have a manageable legend to be able to understand and read the maps and work with them. So even if it would be desirable to have map a map and a classification with a lot of detail, with a species, for example, we have somehow to group or aggregate vegetation types into similar groups according to fire behavior to be able to work with this. So this generalization is kind of a limitation of the methods. Also, we have to consider that some categories might be difficult to map at wide scales, especially with the existing technologies. We are relying on remote sensing, and the existing land cover datasets that we used also relied on remote sensing. So the limitations that, technological limitations that they have are transferred to our European field map. Also, we have to consider that if we want to update the European field map, with the current methods, we need to wait for the updating on the input layers. And the errors that these layers might have are transferred to our European field map because we are using them as source. Also, it is important to say that not all input sources refer to the whole European conditions. This is, for example, the case of the bioclimatic models for shrubland, that the equations that we use to derive the final shrubland potential fuel depth were only developed for arid conditions in Europe. But this was not such a limitation because we saw that more than 80% of shrubland in Europe belong to the arid region. And finally, the limitation that I told you before, that because we are working at 1 kilometer resolution, only 20 out of the 24 first level field types could be mapped, but this doesn't mean that the 4 left are missing in Europe. It's just a matter of the scale. So if we are working with the European field map and the FirEUrisk field classification system, why this map could not work well for our local study areas? Well, first of all, we need to see if recent changes in field types have occurred in the area that we are working at. And also a very interesting thing that might cause most of the problems of the differences, I believe, is mixed pixels. Because our 1 kilometer resolution means that we have mixed pixels. And in that case, for our European field map, we had to choose only one category, the one that we did with the resampling method and trying to smooth by the majority filtering, etc. But we have a mixed pixel. And this means that if we are working at a higher resolution, we can distinguish different field type pixels inside this 1 kilometer resolution pixel of the European field map. So this is especially an issue that might occur in areas with a mosaic pattern of field types. Because remember that we had somehow to generalize the field types and categories because of the resolution. Again, other problems that can lead to not working well for local study areas are the transfer error from input layers. If we are using for our local study areas other input sources, differences can come from here. And also, because we are relying on remote sensing, it can happen confusion between categories with low spectral separability. This means that, for example, it would be errors might be greater between a high grassland and medium grassland instead of between grassland and shrubland, for example, because the most similar the spectral signatures they are, the more difficult are to distinguish these categories. So what we recommend so far is that we try to generate field type maps from our higher resolution sources and local study areas, but all of us using the FirEUrisk field classification system to try to integrate this field mapping and be able to compare them, even if we are outside Europe. And one important thing also is that for areas where there are no field type maps, the European field map can be used, even if it has a coarse resolution. So now, regarding the validation of the European field map, we perform two validation approaches, which are based on several reference data. The main one being the 2018 LUCAS, the Land Use and Coverage Area Frame Survey, which provides photos of georeference points, which refer to land cover types, but with these photos and manual photo interpretation, we can derive the field types and use them for validation. This main reference data was complemented with Google Earth images, Google Earth Street View, and Global Land 30 map to see the percentage of open and closed forest and continuous, discontinuous urban field types to see the whole picture of the 1 kilometer resolution pixel. We applied a stratified random sampling for these validation approaches and obtained two confusion matrices. The first one refers to the 6 main field types, so forest, shrubland, grassland, cropland, wet and pit, semi-pitland, and urban field types plus the non-field category. And we obtained an 88.48% of overall accuracy. And the second validation was performed for all first-level field types in the European territory, and we obtained an 80.92% of overall accuracy. And I was saying before, most of the confusion were found between field types belonging to the same main field type. So, for example, between high grassland and medium grassland instead of between grassland and shrubland because of the spectral separability of field type categories. So now that we understand more or less the validation of our European field map, we can talk about its limitations to understand where errors can come from. So again, we have to consider that transfer errors can come from the input layers. And one of the main tricky things that we found out in the validation were mixed pixels, because remember, we are working at 1 kilometer resolution. So when we use LUCAS photos that only refer to certain points to do this validation, we can have some problems if these photos are not representative of the 1 kilometer resolution pixel, because we are in a mixed pixel. That is why we try to fulfill this limitation by using other sources like Google Earth or Google Street View, etc. Also, another limitation of the validation was the low quality of some LUCAS photos because they were blurred or taken at night. And also we have to consider that there's a slightly difference in the dates of the reference data and the input layers. The LUCAS data is from 2018, whereas the input layers, the land cover data sets, are from 2018, 19, and 20. So this, if the field type has changed rapidly in this time, we can have issues there. And also we have to consider that we are comparing LUCAS information, which refer to land cover, with field types, which are not exactly the same, but very similar. And because we are doing photo interpretation manually, we can easily transform the field cover categories into the field types. So also one of the limitations of the validation is because this manual validation of the photo interpretation of the LUCAS points was very time and energy consuming. We could only apply to a subset of pixels. And again, what we were saying before, that the errors are dependent on the separability of field types with remote sensing. And finally, one of the limitations was that not all the field type categories surpass the desired less than 30% of error, but even though the overall accuracy was quite good. So if we are working at a local scale, where can errors come from? Remember that we talked that in the European scale, we had to somehow generalize the reality of the European landscape at the 1 kilometer resolution, that we can have categorical errors from the input layers, the mixed pixels from the mosaic field types, temporal errors referring to time of the year or recently changed field types, and the low quality of reference data. Now, entering the last part of this first theoretical part, we'll be talking about modeling fire behavior. And in this case, we are referring to field parameters. What are field parameters? Where they are the numerical values required to model the field fire behavior. For example, field height, field load, particle size, etc. And they are necessary because they serve to model fire behavior to prevent fire risk. So we input these field parameters into fire behavior model software to see how a fire would behave in case that it occurs in that pixel. And it is very easy to understand fire behavior and fire risk with this approximation. But other uses that field parameters can have are understanding fire emissions or the recovery of the forest after the fire. Field parameterization has been done previously in the past, and one of the ways that it can be achieved is by using FCCS. And here, for example, we can have an overview of the monthly estimation of the rate of spread globally from FCCS. What we did in our case for the European field map was to adapt the fire risk field classification system and the European field map to one of the most commonly used standard field models, which is the one from Scott and Morgan, which is called the Fire Behavior Field Models, the FBFM. So we did this. And to doing this, we developed a crosswalk to relate our fire risk field types to the Scott and Morgan field types. We did this crosswalk using expert knowledge to relate to the most fitted average conditions in the field. And as we can see here in the table, the result is that we have that for every of our fire risk field types, we have assigned one, well, in this case, two of the Scott and Morgan field types. We are assigning two because we try to account for more heterogeneity in the European territory. So in this way, we distinguish between the arid, semi-arid Europe and the sub-arid, humid Europe, trying to account for the differences in field types that can happen with these bioclimatic conditions. So with this, that what we achieve is that for each of our fire risk field types, we can have the crosswalk to two Scott and Morgan field types, depending on if we are referring to the arid, semi-arid Europe or the two sub-arid or humid Europe. And this is very interesting because it provides more variety of field types and field parameters in this crosswalk. The good thing about using this crosswalk to Scott and Morgan is that this Scott and Morgan field type classification has already assigned a set of parameters, of standard parameters, which are the average parameters values for each of the field types defined by Scott and Morgan. So if we have the crosswalk to relate our fire risk field types to the Scott and Morgan field types, we can directly have information on the field parameters, which can be useful for fire behavior modeling, as we were saying before. But one of the limitations of this approximation is that in our case, each of our field types of the fire risk field classification system is only assigned in the crosswalk to two Scott and Morgan field types, the one referring to the arid Europe and the one referring to the humid Europe. So in this case, we don't have a pixel, a field map with parameters for every pixel, but all the fire risk field types with the same code, they have the same parameters, the average parameters according to this approximation. Well, the results that we obtained so far, we can see here some examples for field parameters for Scott and Bergen. In the left, we can see the dead 1 hour field load, and in the right, we can see the surface field depth. And one important thing that we have to consider also is that Scott and Bergen is only referring to surface field types and parameters. So canopy fuels are not parameterized with this. So we need to further do research about this to be able to map parameters referring to canopy fields. This is what we are currently working on through alternative approaches. We are trying to develop custom crosswalk and complete with detailed information to develop pixel level maps so that we can have for both surface and canopy parameters, pixel level maps so that we can distinguish about, we can see the heterogeneity of one single FirEUrisk field type, which might be different in parameterization depending on the pixel we are referring to. Even if they belong to the same field type, they can have different parameters. And for this, we are working within detailed data sets and LiDAR data. We are currently working on this in detail parameterization with canopy pixel level maps, trying to improve fire propagation models, and we are doing this through the calibration of models for European conditions using LiDAR data. We are almost done with the canopy height and canopy cover maps for Europe and currently working on canopy base height. But in the future, we also plan to develop maps on field load and canopy bulk density to have an overview of the canopy field parameters. Here we can see an example of what we've been doing so far for the field parameterization of canopy fields. In the left, we can see the forest field height for the forest cover, and in the right, the forest field canopy cover for the forest field types. So as a summary, what we did so far was the first step towards an integrated European FirEUrisk strategy, and the hierarchical field classification system and the European field map are expected to serve managers to obtain global estimations of fire behavior, fire risk assessment, and reduction. But the FirEUrisk field classification system can serve to generate high-resolution field type maps and parameters using in-detail data sets, high-resolution optical imagery, such as Sentinel-2, high-resolution radar imagery, such as Sentinel-1, LiDAR data using drone, airborne, or satellite LiDAR data, forest inventory data, field data, or any data that can be useful for this purpose. So finally, it's interesting to understand the strengths and weaknesses of our methods and products in order to use them wisely. So the main strengths is that we have with the FirEUrisk a common field classification system to harmonize fire risk assessment, which is scalable and has an integrated structure and can provide an overview of fire risk at a continental scale. And the methods that we applied are replicable. Some of the strongest weaknesses are that we had somehow to aggregate the field types into groups and that the maps have errors as every map that is created, and that further work needs to be done to improve field type mapping at small areas and parameterized fields. But even with the weaknesses, we believe that these strengths are bigger than these weaknesses, and the product is very useful. So where can we find the FirEUrisk field classification system and the European field map, and how to cite the product and material? Well, here you have the official citation way of the map, which is the data set in the repository with DOI, and the product user manual, which you can also download from the repository, and the paper, which I told you that is currently under review, but we expect that is accepted very soon. Final recommendations. Remember always to cite correctly the data, read the product user manual in case of any doubt, and take into account the limitations that we have been talking about and use wisely the data. So now we have finished with the theoretical part. We have time for a Q&A part. Please write the questions in the chat. And one thing that we would like to ask you is that if you are working with the European field map and you see any problem in any region, it is interesting that you contact us to tell us the problems. But remember again that the European field map is at a more or less coarse resolution. So if you find that a very small thing or a mixed area is not well represented, remember that this can be because of the spatial resolution and not because of a real problem of the product.
Thank you, Elena. And also for this interesting presentation, for this theoretical part, and also thanks to Professor Ciuvieco for his broad introduction. There are several questions, so I can read it loud, and then you can answer. The first one is very easy. Is Cyprus included?
Well, let me check, but I guess yes, it is included.
Okay, then is there a chance to access the 100-meter resolution version?
Well, we have been asked this question several times. The thing is that for the moment, I would say no, because as I was saying before, the 100-meter resolution is like a preliminary version, but not all the input sources were that high resolution. We had some of the land cover datasets which had 300-meter resolution, and the precipitation data used for the bioclimatic modeling that had 1 kilometer resolution. So even if they were resampled to 100 meter at the beginning to match this first step, it won't be very accurate. And also the 100-meter resolution map is not validated, only the 1 kilometer resolution. So for the moment, I would say that we are not delivering this map at 100-meter resolution. And in the case of the European scale, we believe that 1 kilometer is enough to have an overview of fire risk, because our intention is not to model single fires with the European field map. That would be done with the high resolution maps for the pilot sites, etc. So our idea is only to have this broader overview. So we believe that for the moment, 1 kilometer resolution is enough.
Another question from Olga Viedma that I say hi. How did you estimate forest canopy cover canopy cover at tree height?
I guess this question is regarding our current work, the last part that we developed the forest height and canopy cover. For this, as I was explaining, but very briefly before, we used LiDAR data to obtain the vertical structure of forest. So in short, what we did was to calibrate some models, first with airborne LiDAR, and related it to satellite LiDAR. In this case, we are using JEDI. And with this calibration of models, we apply them to the rest of Europe using all the auxiliary data such as optical and radar data to have this continuous map of European parameters. This work is not completely finished. That is why we didn't present it today, but the general idea is this one.
Okay. Another question from Jose Maria Costa. Are you considering to create maps also for past periods, such as those of Corilla and Cover, for example, 1990, 2000, 2006, and so on? It will prove useful for studying several issues related with past fire event. Thanks.
Yes, well, yes, it's an interesting question, but for the moment, we have not planned that, because as we are saying, we are relying on external pre-existing datasets, and for example, yes, the Corine has previous versions, but I'm not sure if all of the input data sets that we are using have previous versions that coincide with these times of the Corine land cover. Also, for the field parameterization, because we are using GDI, it won't be possible to do these past maps because GDI is very new. So, and our idea is to have the categorical field map together with the maps on field parameters. So it's not something that we are planning to do. It is more likely that we would update the field type map in the future than that we go back. So for the moment, I would say no.
Okay. Another question from Olga Vietma again. Why did you decide to consider as open forest those one with FCC between 15 and 70%?
Well, the thresholds used for all the categories of the fuel classification system, not only the canopy cover, also the fuel depth, etc., were based on expert knowledge. So we asked people working on fuel types, fire behavior modeling, and also we saw pre-existing definition on fuel types that were very general and commonly accepted. So we applied these same thresholds. In the case of open and closed forests, I guess this definition comes from the United Nations definition or from the Copernicus Global Land Cover Map that has the same general definition on closed and open forests. So we stretch to this to have a common definition with the rest of the products.
A question from Luis Galicia. Do you think this method can be applied in tropical regions? Limitation regarding fuel loads, forest types? I think, yeah, if any.
Well, I guess that the general methods, the idea behind the methods can be easily applied to other parts of the world. But of course, depending on the region you are working at, you might have to change maybe some things if you don't have some data available or if you have other better data available instead. So things might have changed also if you are working at higher resolutions, but I believe that the general idea of how this is developed can be easily applied.
There is a question about crown base height. Probably our participant Jakob Ziprovsky is asking if you derived or if you use it, the CBH.
Well, this is what we are currently working at. We are almost finishing with it, and our idea is to derive a European fuel map with the estimated canopy base height for the forest cover.
Okay. Marco Galatola is asking if you could you explain in details the validation process. Well, I think that you already, but if you want to say something more, Elena.
Well, the validation was quite complex. I guess that if you have more interest in this, you can go to the paper and read it because it has more details, because we had first to filter the data, etc. But as I was saying before, the main reference source was the Lucas data. And we use the information and photos provided by this reference data to compare with our results. And because we are considering 1 kilometer resolution and not only points, which are the Lucas points, to account for the whole 1 kilometer pixel, we complemented with information like the Google Earth images to see if the point of the Lucas, the photo of the Lucas point was representative of the 1 kilometer resolution pixel. this is the main idea, but if you go to the paper, you have in detail what we did there.
From José Bengoa, talking about the next steps, you mentioned propagation models. What models are you considering, keeping in mind that such models are designed for specific fuel classifications?
Well, in this case, one of the good things of adapting the fuel classification system to Scott and Morgan, one of the existing fuel classification systems, is that we can use models that are prepared for this fuel classification. But the ideal thing would also be to develop models that could use as input data other fuel classification systems or parameters which are pixel leveled. So I guess this is something that we are also working on at the FirEUrisk project. I don't know, Emilio, if you want to say something about this.
Sorry, I didn't hear very well. Could you repeat the question?
Yes. The question is about the propagation model that will be used and that will use the the fuel maps. What model are you considering, keeping in mind that such models are designed for specific fuel classifications?
Yeah. Well, we are now considering two possibilities at the European scale. One, the fuel class classification system, where the parameters are included in the definition of the models, and the other would be just to program the Rudder-Mel equations. So there is another group that is dealing with fire propagation within the project, but at European scale, since the standard fuel classification like FLAMA, for instance, they do not allow to have gridded meteorological data. We are adapting, let's say, this model to the two weather scenarios that we are going to use for computing this propagation potential at the European scale. Again, as Elena said before, the product is not meant to be used for modeling specific fires, but rather to analyze propagation potential at the European scale.
Probably also this, you can, Professor Ciuvieco, you can answer to this other question. Are you going to consider future scenarios accounting for changes in fuel loads under climate and socioeconomic change? If yes, what time horizon?
Well, the project has 2050 and 2100. And yes, we are going to, there is another group, another work package that is dealing with adaptation to future conditions, and they are using dynamic global vegetation models with a fire model inside. And the LPJ is the biochemistry model, let's say, and they also ORCIDE, they are using both models for the future conditions, plus land use modeling. There's another specific group working with land use scenarios. And the idea is to combine dynamic global vegetation models with land use scenario modeling to estimate what would be the potential conditions of future fuels.
If I can comment on this, indeed, this will be the focus of further training, but probably at the end of 2024. So in 1 year, because this group is working on that right now, and it takes time. So another, if you want, Elena. Yeah.
Sorry, just to mention that
Clelia.
there are also questions on the QA.
Okay, then we can. Yes,
yeah,
so you can
have a look.
yes, so you can take the lead for this. Yes, Clelia.
I don't know, there are many left on the chat. Do you want to go all those through?
Well, we can leave them also for later on, or because there are many questions in the chat, or answering by email, and we can share the a document with all the participants as you want. It depends on you. I don't want to.
Okay. I guess
it depends on Elena and
Elena.
Professor Ciuvieco. Yes, in that sense.
Well,
thank you all for your questions and your interest. Wow.
Yes.
You have the schedule, Elena, so you know, because this is supposed to finish at 12, so we have only 35 minutes left.
Yeah. So
okay, let's just there are 3 only in the QA. If we could just go through there and then we can continue. The first one is can't see the name very clearly. Has the layer of the areas already burned, traversed by fire, been taken into consideration where the fuel models are usually biased at the time, or retraverse?
Well, burnt areas are considered because in the Corine land cover map, there's a category with burnt areas. So the ones that are there are considered, but if something has burned after that, it won't be considered.
Okay, great. From Paula Maya, why does grassland imply more risk than surplant?
Because of the parameters of this field type category, because the, if I'm not mistaken, the spread rate is higher. So that is why we consider it more risky.
Thank you, Elena. And the last one from Pedro Sanchez. Is it expected fuel map products with better spatial resolution than multiply 1 kilometer in the project?
Well, in the project, yes, not a European scale, but we have the pilot site field maps with which are 1 hectare. And also we might have field maps for some demonstrations area, which have also high resolution. But as I was saying before, for the European scale, it's not intended in the project to go more in detail than 1 kilometer resolution. But for certain areas, the pilot site areas, yes, this would be done.
Great. Thank you, Elena. That's from the QA panel. So if you want to continue.
If you want, I can. I have other one. Let's say 3 questions, and then we can other 3 questions, and then we can stop if you want.
Well, if not, we can maybe answer them after the end.
Okay.
Because at the end, even if we have now the practical part, I think the best thing is not to answer specific problems, so we can talk about again the theoretical part. Okay, perfect. Then I leave you the floor again for the practical part. Thanks. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to share again my screen. Okay, so now we are going to do a little practical part, which consists on the generation of fuel parameters for Europe. I'm going to be doing it with you, so we can do it all together. I'm going to go slowly so that we can follow, but in case that you get lost, you can go to the slides, and all these steps are in the slides, so you can easily catch up. And also, this session is being recorded, so in any case, you can go back again and try to do the practical part. And of course, if you still have doubts, you can write to me. So, okay, let's go on with the practical part. For this, we are going to be using the QGIS software that we ask you to download before this, and also the files that we sent you by email. Well, first of all, I'm going to give you an overview of what we are going to do, and then we will do it all together. So what we are going to do is to use the FirEUrisk European field map in the raster format, which has the categorical, the categorical categories of the FirEUrisk field classification system, and we are going to use the crosswalk to Scott and Bergen to derive map of field parameters. So for this, we are going to use the European field map. And we are going to be using the crosswalk to Scott and Bergen that we saw before, that has already the standard average parameters for each of the Scott and Bergen field types. So for this, we are going to be using a table that we provided you, which has the crosswalk between these two classification systems. The first column would be referring to the FirEUrisk field classification system, and the second column to the fire behavior field models, which are the ones from Scott and Bergen. And then we have for each of these categories the parameters, the average parameters for all of these. Remember that I told you before that in the crosswalk we distinguish between the arid and the humid Europe. So we are going to also be doing this to account for more variability in Europe, and we are going to distinguish this in this way. So, for example, if we have the FirEUrisk field type, which is minus 41, this means that we are referring to the 41 field type, which in this case is herbaceous cropland, but because it has the minus before the number, we are referring to the arid Europe. Whereas if we are referring to just 41 without any sign before the number, we are referring in this case to herbaceous cropland from the humid Europe. I hope this is understood. And as I explained before, we are going to be distinguishing between arid Europe and humid Europe according to this map that we also developed for the project. So what we are going to be doing is to match this raster layer with this table with the crosswalk to finally obtain a European field map on fuel parameters, which would look like something like this. So now we are going to all together do this practical part. Here you have all these steps, which are very easy. Remember, if you get lost, you can go here. And what we are going to do is an example of fuel parameterization. We are going to do a map of Europe of fuel depth. That, remember, that is surface fuel depth, because Scott and Bergen refers only to surface fuel types. But it is important for you to know that you can do the same procedure for every parameter to obtain European field maps on all of these parameters that are defined in the standard Scott and Bergen field models. So let's start. The first step, very easy, is to open QGIS. So I'm going to open it with you so we can do it all together. If you don't see this screen, but I guess it is seen, please tell me. I will be using version 3.16, but with any version that you would use, it should work the same. And also, in this course, we have decided to use QGIS software as a free GIS software so that everyone can do this procedure. But remember that you can do the same with any other software, GIS software that you know, free software or even commercial software. If, for example, you are using ArcGIS, this procedure would be a little bit easier because you don't have to do so many steps. But as I said before, here we decide to use this free software. Also, if you know programming, this procedure will also be faster. But in this case, because we have people from all the levels, including graduate students that don't need to know how to programming, we have decided to do it this way so that everyone can have easily an overview of how field parameterization can be done. But of course, the methodology and procedures would be very similar to all of the programming and other commercial softwares. So we have opened QGIS. The first step, I guess everyone is here. And what we are going to do now is to load our raster map with the FirEUrisk European field map and our table with the crosswalk. So very easy. The second step, we are going to first open our raster layer with the European field map. And well, we are going to explore also the data. To explore the data, we are going to right button click on our raster layer and click on properties. If we go to symbology and the render type and palette unique values, we can classify and obtain the list of our fuel types with that are in our European field map. These are random colors, is not the palette that is on the official product, but you can easily change the colors if you want. As you can see here, we have the value column, which refers to the field type code that I showed you before that we had in the FirEUrisk field classification system with the table and how to read it. So, for example, we have a 1302 code, which in this case refers to closed mixed forest, to the omit Europe, because we don't have the minus before the number. And remember here, we are distinguishing between arid and omit Europe. And if we go up, we can see that we have the equivalent of this mixed closed forest for the arid Europe because it has the minus before. This is not exactly the European field map that you can download from the repository. In the repository, you don't have this distinction between the arid and the omit Europe, just the regular field types. But for the field parameterization, we provide it this way, and actually it is very easy to be done with the other map with the arid and omit Europe that we showed you before. So here we have the list of all the fuel types that we have for Europe. If we click OK, we can have them. We have shown them in Europe, and we see that each of these pixels has assigned a category of our FirEUrisk field map. Let's now open our table with the crosswalk. So we open our table with the crosswalk and we proceed to explore it also. If we again right button click over our table and click over Open Attribute Table, we can see the table with the crosswalk. The first column, called Fuel, refers to our FirEUrisk field classification system and has the same codes of our fuel map with the distinction between the arid and the omit Europe. And the second column, which is called FBFM, refers to the fire behavior field models from Scott and Morgan. So this is the crosswalk. And the rest of the columns refer to the parameters that are already defined by the Scott and Morgan. So in our case, as I told you before, we are going to be mapping surface field depth. So we are going to be referring to the column called depth. One important thing is that depending on the region you are or the configuration of your computer, you may have to change how to separate decimal numbers, if with a dot or with a comma. But I did it with a point, trying to account for what mostly people do. But if you have any problem with this table, remember that one of the issues can come from here. Okay, so this is what we have to start with. If we go back to our scheme of our steps, we have already done step number 2 and number 3 because we already explored both the raster and the table data. So now we are going for the 4th step. And what we are going to do is to transform our raster data with the European field types into vector data, because we need to add the information on the fuel parameters. And remember that raster layers can only have one attribute. And in this case, we have the attribute of the FirEUrisk field types. So we need to first transform this raster layer into vector. When we have it in vector, we can add the information on fuel depth, and then we have to go back to raster format to have the raster map of European fuel depth. And this is what we are going to do. So for this, we are going, first step, as I said before, to transform our raster data to vector data. And we are going to be using the tool in QGIS called raster pixels to points, so that every of our raster pixels is now a point, which is going to be in the center of that pixel. Let's go to QGIS and do it all together. If we click on our processing toolbox, we can search for the tools. And in this case, as I said before, we are going to search for the raster pixel to points tool. So we open the raster pixel to points in QGIS and select that our raster layer is the FirEUrisk European field map. The field name that we want to pass to our vector layer is going to be the value, which, if you remember, is the column with the field type codes from the FirEUrisk field classification system. And once we have here, we just click over Run to create our vector layer. This should be very fast because it is very easy and it's already done. We can close the window. And if you see, we have created the vector points of the European field map. I'm going to go closer so that you can see in detail that each of our original pixels has inside in the center a vector. And this vector has the same information as the original pixel had. We can check this through the Identify Features option. So, for example, if you click over this button and over our vector points, we can choose one of our points, for example, this one, and we see that the value, the column with the value of the FirEUrisk European field map is 1302. So again, the mixed closed forest. If we want to check which was the original pixel value of the raster, we click over the raster layer and over the pixel to check that, of course, is the same number, the field type code of 1302 closed mixed forest. So our vector points were created correctly. Now let's go to our fifth point. So once we've created our vector layer with the information of our FirEUrisk field types, is the moment to do the join of this layer with the Scott and Borgen parameters. So to the table of Scott and Borgen. Let's do this all together. If we right button click over the vector points and click over properties, and here we again click over joins, we can easily add a join to an existing table. So we can add it through the button which is called Add New Join at the end of the window. And here we should have already the information that we need. The layer that we are going to join is the crosswalk table. The join field is the one called fuel, because if you remember, the first column in the crosswalk table was fuel, and this column was the one with the information of the FirEUrisk field classification system. And our target field would be the field value, which is the value with the information of the FirEUrisk field classification system in the vector layer. So I hope everyone is here. This is very easy. We just click OK when we have preparing the join, and we see that, of course, the join is already done successfully. Okay, don't close this window now, because if you close it, you have to do again the join, but it is very easy. Let's go now to the sixth point, which is to prepare the data to the parameterization. So let's go all together again to the practical part. Okay, if we are still over the properties of the vector points layer, and we go to see the fields that we have, we see now that we have several fields. The first row, the one in yellow, is the original attribute of the table, which has the value of the FirEUrisk field classification system. And all the rest of the columns, the ones in green, are the ones coming from the join. In this case, what we are looking for is the number 10, which refers to depth, which, remember, is the parameter that we want to map. But as you can see here, this column is referred as string, so characters. And surface field are not characters, are numbers. More precisely, we're talking about meters, and we have up to 2 decimal numbers because we are considering meters, but up to centimeters. So to be able to map correctly this field parameter, we have to change this attribute from string into a decimal number. So what we are going to do for this is to first edit the layer by clicking on the pencil button. And once we have started editing, we are going to go to the field calculator through this button here to create this new field. So what we're going to do is to click on create new field, because we are going to create this new field with the same information of the field depth, but in numerical number. And we are going to give a name to our new attribute, which, for example, is going to be field depth. In the output field type, we have to say that we want a decimal number, because we are talking that this is what we needed. And finally, in expression, we are going to say that we want the same information as the attribute referring to field depth. So what we're going to do is to go to fields and values. And here, double click over the field depth attribute so that it appears here at the left. So once we have everything prepared, selected the create new field, the output field name, the output field type, and the expression that we want to apply, we just click over OK, and the new field would be created. This new field, remember, it should be the same field as the field depth, but instead of being string, it should be decimal number so that we can properly map it. So we can see now that we have the second row in yellow, a new attribute, which is the one we created, called field depth, and is type double, which means decimal, which means numerical value. So we are already prepared for mapping our field depth. We can just stop the editing mode by again clicking the pencil, and remember to save our changes. So now let's go to the next step, because we've already done the step number 6, which is to do this preparation of the data. And we have already done step number 7, which is that we have already the depth field in the points layer, because we did the join, and in numerical type. So let's go now for the last step, which is number 8, which is going to be the contrary that we did before. Remember that before we passed from raster to vector. Now we're going from vector again back to raster to create a raster with the value of the field depth, not the field type, which was the raster that we had before, but now the field depth. And for this, we're going to be using the tool called Rasterize. So we go back again to our QGIS. We can close now this window. And again, in our processing toolbox, we can search for the tools that we need. In this case, we can search for the Rasterize vector to raster tool. So we double click over this tool and just introduce our data easily to be able to create our map on field depth. So our input layer is going to be the vector points because it is the layer with the information on the field depth. And the field that we are going to be used is the field depth, because if we used the value field, we would create again the original raster that we had before with the information on the FirEUrisk field types. So in this case, we want a raster with the information on field depth, which is the parameter we want to map for Europe. We are going to add some additional information because we want to map it correctly for Europe. So in the output raster size units, we are going to select georeference units, which means that we are going to be referring to meters in the next steps that we're going to do. Because remember that the European field map is projected in the ETRS 89 Lambert azimuthal equal area, which is in meters. So this means that when we now are going to define the dimensions of the pixels, we are going to set them in meters. So let's set the dimensions of the pixels. Let's go now to width and horizontal resolution. Here we are going to be defining the size of the pixel. Because the European field map is at 1 kilometer resolution, we want that our field map, well, our parameter maps are also in 1 kilometer resolution, and that these pixels match exactly with the location and dimensions of the pixels of the European field map. So that is why we are going to define here 100 meters, because we are referring to the 100 meter resolution, which is this, 1,000 meters, which is the same as 1 kilometer resolution, which are the original dimensions of our European field map. And we are going to do this for the horizontal resolution and also for the vertical resolution. So we have a squared pixel of 1 kilometer resolution. So once we have these two steps done, the last step is to define the output extent. And here we are going to tell the program that we want that the location of this 1 kilometer pixel is the same as the location of the pixels in the raster value that we have with the original raster value with the information of the field types. So here we are going to click on the display arrow and click over calculate from layer, and here select our raster layer, which means that we are going to use the same dimensions and locations of the pixels from this raster layer. Okay, we click over it and just click over run. I'm going to put it here the steps in case that anyone has any doubt. This procedure is going to take a bit longer, but not much, because it's a little bit more complex. And in the meanwhile, while we wait for this to be done, I'm going to show you what the result would have to look like to be able to compare it. Because after we finish this step, we just got the step number 9 with each to obtain the final map on field depth, which should be something like this. This is the one that we have developed for the project, that, as you can see, the maximum value is 1.83 meters, because remember, again, we are talking only about surface fuel types, because we are referring to Scott and Bergen. And in the case of forest, we are referring to understory, the understory layer. So we have to wait a little bit until this is done. Remember that if you do this programming, it would be probably much faster, or with other softwares. In ArcGIS, you can do the join easily. For example, you don't have to first pass it to vector and then again to raster, but the methodology and the theoretical procedure behind this is the same for every software. So we can see that this is already done. So we can close the window. And in the meanwhile, I'm going to show you what we obtained. Okay, let's we obtained this layer, but let's visualize it correctly. So right button click on our raster layer again, the new that we created, and if we click over properties and symbology, we can establish the render type as palette unique values. And in this case, we are going to select a color ramp, which is going to be from the display button, for example, in greens. Okay, and if we click over classify, we are going to obtain our map with the categories of fuel depth. As you can see, the maximum value is 1.83, which is the one that we had in the map that we should copy. So let me show you here, the one here. So apparently it is done correctly. So we just click over OK, and we have our final map on fuel depth, which, as you can see, has the same distribution of the map that I showed you here, with the highest values for example, Northern Europe, etc. So we have finished with this generation of the map on surface field depth. Remember that you can do the same procedure for the rest of the parameters defined in the Scott and Bergan set of parameters with the crosswalk that we did, and that this map can be used for fire behavior modeling. So I hope I didn't go very fast and everyone was able to follow. So now this is an ending of the practical part on mostly the training course. I would first want to acknowledge and thank the FirEUrisk project for letting me work with them and doing this training course, and also the University of Alcalá and the Environmental Research Remote Sensing Research Group, which is where Emilio and I am working on. And we will finally, again, do a little Q&A, even if it's 12 o'clock, maybe we can stay a little bit more to ask questions in case they have. Again, write them, place them in the chat. And if you have anyway questions that were not solved, you can also write us and we'll try to answer them. The only thing is that because we are too many, I would ask you not to answer specific questions regarding the practical parts, the things that didn't work for you. In that case, I would suggest that you go back to the slides and read in more detail what we were doing, because it is very easy. And if not, you can go back to this presentation because it's going to be recorded. And if not, of course, you can also write to me. So that would be everything from my side, from the practical part, and we can proceed again to the questions.
Thank you, Elena. We already received some very positive feedbacks, so many thanks for this training activity. So let me check. We have some questions from the previous session. We haven't replied yet. One is from Bikem Ekberzade. Are you planning on expanding the dataset spatial extent to cover entire EEA, specifically toward the east, to include Mediterranean forest ranges in full?
I guess this question is talking about the spatial extent of the European
Yes.
Okay, map. Well, at the beginning of the project, we decided which was the spatial extent of what we understood as the European territory, and we tried to cover like a very big territory, but of course some parts of Europe cannot be considered. For the moment, we are not planning to develop this European field map for other areas. And it would be a little bit tricky because some of the input layers are not for outside Europe. For example, I believe the ones coming from the European Union, like the Corine Land Cover, etc., do not cover other parts of the world. But in that case, the thing would be to find an equivalent of other existing land cover datasets, for example, in this case, and apply the same methodology, but with this data to our study area. So we are not planning to do it, but I guess it would be easy if it would be done.
Another question from Beatriz Faria. Is there any component about the ecosystem services?
No, not directly.
Maybe Emilio, okay.
Yeah, it's not in the field system, but it's another activity within FirEUrisk that are analyzing ecosystem services values, but it's not part of this activity.
Okay. How did you decide to mostly rely on mapped data when creating the fuel maps? Are you considering to include more measured data for better class discrimination, as e.g. DESIS? Thank you.
For the moment, we are more or less happy with the discrimination of classes that we did with the FirEUrisk field map, because we are now focusing on field parameterization. I believe that one of the most interesting things is that maybe not having a very in detail categorical map, because it would be very difficult to manage and to understand, but very interesting to have this parameterization with pixel in pixel details, so that so that we have values for parameters for every pixel. And in this case, even if we have some areas belonging to the same field type, they would be different and would have different fire behavior because of this different field parameterization. So this is also a way to enrich and enlarge the field classification system, because the areas would be similar but different also.
Yeah, if I may add something there. Well, the idea of the classification scheme is to be scale independent, so you can use the same classes and obviously go to more detail as more input data you have, and the same with parameters. The Scott and Burgan is just a way of starting the parameterization, but you can derive from your own ground data, or I mean, you are doing actually by Valentina your own ground measurements, or from other much more detailed remote sensing measurements, either drones or airborne LiDAR, etc. Obviously, that would benefit. No? So what Elena presented is the global picture, no? But obviously at more detailed scale, the more data you have, the more detailed data, the more accurate would be the propagation and estimations.
There aren't any other questions in the chat. I don't know, Clelia, if you have some question in the Q&A box.
Hello. Let me check once more. No, they're the ones that I previously read through. I'm going to say again, also myself, Elena, thank you so much, and Emilio, about great presentation and great demonstration of the tool. And this is the feedback we are mostly getting from the chat at the moment. How clear and concise was everything? Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So if there aren't any questions, if I I haven't missing any other question, but in any case, we'll now download the chat. We will go through. If we miss something, we will reply to all of you by email. I would like to thank very much our speaker today, so Elena and Professor Ciuvieco, and also I would like to thank Clelia Petru, who coordinates WP6 in FirEUrisk project, who helped me in managing the training. So thank you all very much. And also I would like to thank all the participants for their interest, all the questions. So we will share the recording also through the FirEUrisk website. And finally, I would like
Valentina, before you
yes.
close, thank you for organizing everything, for planning it, organizing it, doing the session, sending all the emails, and you did everything, actually, all the background organization. Thank you so much.
Our duty. Thanks. I would like to share my screen if I can. Can you see my screen with the next event? Okay, so I would like to invite you, all of you, the 22nd of February for the second FirEUrisk training event related on mapping wildland-urban interface, so the so-called WUE. And so that's it. I thank everybody again and see you next time. So